Hey, happy Tuesday morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Hope you had an absolutely fantastic Memorial Day weekend. Hope you did, in fact, give thought and appreciation to all of those men and women who have fought so bravely, who have served so diligently to make sure that we have the liberty to do things like I'm doing right now. And that is to share my thoughts, my convictions, my study with you in an unfettered way. You do realize, do you not, that many countries simply will not allow this freedom of expression. There are no Muslim countries, for instance, that would welcome such YouTube presentations. So you and I live in a marvelous country, and our freedom has been bought, it has been purchased by the sacrifice of our military personnel, both men and women, and we truly appreciate that. Well, we are in the midst of our study, our thematic study of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul said, flesh and blood does not inherit the kingdom of heaven. He is linking resurrection with entrance into the kingdom. Now, historically, at least certainly, in the fellowship in which I was raised, it was believed that the kingdom was established in full power and glory and completeness on the day of Pentecost. But when the New Testament talks about the future kingdom, that is talking about the so-called end of time, the end of the Christian age. But of course, the Bible never talks about the end of time, and it most assuredly never says a thing in the world about the end of the Christian age. So that view is fundamentally flawed. But what I'm showing is that resurrection and kingdom are motifs that are absolutely 100% interlocked with one another, and they are invariably placed at the end of the Old Covenant age of Israel, once again, not at the end of the endless Christian age. Now, a simple proof of that, a powerful proof, as a matter of fact, is found in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1, as Paul wrote to the evangelist Timothy, and he says, I charge you therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who will, good old King James, but the literal rendering should be, who is about to judge the living and the dead at his appearing and kingdom. So what do we have? We have the judgment of the living and the dead, which is the resurrection, and we have the kingdom. These are both synchronous, same-time events. I made this point, for instance, in my formal public debate with Dr. David Hester in 2016 here at the Preterist Pilgrim Weekend. Dr. Hester got up and chided me for my appeal to the Greek word mello in the infinitive, which means, according to virtually all Greek lexicons, the primary definition, the primary basic definition is about to be, about to take place. Dr. David Hester said, oh, no, it's just a paraphrastic expression for a simple futurity. Well, you know, I could sit here and read to you quotes from world-leading scholars, world-leading linguistics on the Greek who disagree with that. Now, are there some who try to establish that? Yes, there are. But there are certainly others who are, again, world-class linguists who understand, who teach, and who say that mello in the infinitive, as it is in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1 and 2, demands imminence. Now, when Dr. Hester objected to the use of the word mello as about to be, I took note of the following. Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 5, Christ said, Peter said that Christ was, quote, ready to judge the living and the dead. Well, he uses the Greek word hetoimos. Hetoimos means not only morally ready, morally prepared, but temporally ready. So we have Peter affirming that Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. In verse 7, he said, the end of all things has drawn near. The end of all things had drawn near. Well, is it the resurrection at the end, 1 Corinthians 15:19 and following? Of course it is. I challenged Dr. Hester to prove that the end of 1 Corinthians 15 was not the end of 1 Peter chapter 4. He never said one word about that in response. I then noted that in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 17, Peter said, pardon me, literally, the appointed time for the judgment has arrived. Now, he uses what is known as the anaphoric article. The anaphoric article, simply stated, is a writer or a speaker introduces a subject. Later in his discussion of that subject, he uses the definite article to call attention back to that subject that he has introduced. Now, simply stated, what that means is, verse 5 is the introduction of the subject of judgment. Verse 17 is Peter referring back to verse 5. Verse 5 is the judgment of the living and the dead. It's the judgment of the living and the dead of 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1. But that's the resurrection. And Peter said, the appointed time for the judgment of the living and the dead, in other words, for the resurrection, has come. Could language get any clearer? Folks, unless the judgment of the living and the dead, pardon me, of 1 Peter chapter 4 is different from the judgment of the living and the dead of 2 Timothy chapter 4. And by the way, Dr. David Hester, in response to my argument, got up and said, well, Don Preston seems to think that just because 1 Peter chapter 4 talks about AD 70 and the fall of Jerusalem, that's all it talks about. Well, that's all it's talking about. Where do you get anything else out of that text? He doesn't mention one single additional word about another judgment of the living and the dead, about another end of all things, about another appointed time for the judgment. So when I challenged Dr. Hester to show us that 2 Timothy chapter 4 and 1 Timothy chapter 4 are different judgments of the living and the dead, he said not one single word in response, and that's because he couldn't. Well, that proves that mello in 2 Timothy chapter 4 really did mean about to judge. And that means that 1 Corinthians 15, which is the time of the judgment of the living and the dead, the judgment of the living and the dead of 2 Timothy 4, and the judgment of the living and the dead of 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 5 through 17, was genuinely, objectively imminent when Paul and Peter wrote. This motif of resurrection and kingdom cannot be separated, and it is unequivocally posited in the first century imminent fulfillment. Thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings, and we've got more on Paul's motif of resurrection and the kingdom. So we'll see you on the flip side.